The Angels currently have the two best baseball players on the face of the earth and maybe the two most talented players who've ever walked this planet. They also have the most conniving, meddling, Mr. Burnsian owner in North American sports. Yes, Arte Moreno announced he's planning to sell the Angels, but his 2 decades of ownership not only broke the team and its fans, it also marred the entire city of Anaheim in scandal. As I take you through the disaster years of Arte's ownership, I'm gonna stack some paper. This here is all the money the team spent on big-time free agents between 2004 and 2020. The Angels are one of just 4 teams to spend over $1 billion in that window, but that money is nothing more than a facade to trick the average fan into believing that this team is trying to win. Before I answer how someone who's spent so much can be such a miser, I have to set the scene at the peak of Arte's ownership. It's October of 2009. The Angels are looking for their first AL pennant since their World Series run 7 years prior. When they came away with the ALDS victory over the Red Sox, they finally got their revenge over the team that ended their season not once, not twice, but 3 times since their last pennant. Even though this era of Angels baseball was easily the most successful in team history, they hadn't really come close to an encore of that magical 2002. Their other time in the championship series since then came in 2005, where they lost the last 4 games of a lopsided series with the White Sox. 2009 was their second and maybe last chance to get back on top. Since he signed with the team in 2004, Vladimir Guerrero was the Angels. The Anaheim Angels, the Los Angeles Angels, whatever they were called, it was his team. But 2009 was a tough year, and also his last year under contract. Fighting through injuries that relegated him to a DH spot, he put up career lows across the board as his franchise aspired to reach new heights. With younger players vying for his at-bats, this October looked like Vlad's last dance in Anaheim, but he still came through for his team when it mattered most.
Guerrero swings and lines it into center field. It's in for a hit. From third base comes Figgins to tie the score. Here comes Abreu, and the Angels will take the lead.
3 batters in a row, the Angels were down to their final strike, but all 3 came through, and Vlad delivered the series-clinching hit to finally beat Boston. Something felt different about the 2009 Angels. Year after year, they were the fodder for the teams that went on to do special things, and they never really invoked the atmosphere of that 2002 team. That is, until this rally. It had to be their year, right? They had an incredibly deep lineup, great starters, a strong bullpen, star power, and past defeats to fuel them. The only problem is, they ran into a buzzsaw. In a hard-fought series with the Yankees, whose decade had played out in an eerily similar fashion up to that point, the Angels kept it close before falling to the evil empire in 6 games. They once again came up empty in the playoffs, and 2002 felt all the more distant. But what fans didn't realize at the time was that they wouldn't be here again. Not even close. For as grueling as the constant October defeats were, they were an oasis compared to the vast 15-year trek through the desert that followed. On May 15, 2003, Major League Baseball and its owners approved the sale of the Anaheim Angels from the Walt Disney Company to Arte Moreno. Moreno paid out $182 million in cash. Wait, $182 million? Even before 2 decades of inflation, that seems really low by sports franchise standards. But Disney was motivated to sell, to say the least, after going to 9 figures of debt during their brief time as owners. The team exchanged hands from a cold, bloated corporation to maybe the most self-made owner in sports. Arte was a Vietnam War vet who studied marketing at Arizona on the GI Bill, eventually building a billboard empire and selling it for billions. As part of a generation that was finding it increasingly difficult to do so, Arte succeeded in living out the American dream, and it was his turn to give back to the people. Ticket and beer prices were slashed. I'm talking the day the deal was official. He left the owner's suite and mingled with fans, and he always asked them what he could do to improve their experience. After all, he's a marketer. It's his job to get fans into the park. And judging by the attendance numbers, the new policies were working wonders. Even though the defending champs disappointed on the field, winning just 77 games, they brought over 3 million fans into Angel Stadium, good for 3rd most in the AL and most in franchise history. But Arte wasn't done. This was a team with championship aspirations, and in his first off-season as owner, he did not cheap out. Kelvin Escobar, Bartolo Colon, and Vladimir Guerrero. These were the new Angels. The payroll spike led to their first division title since the 80s and 3rd best attendance in all of baseball. Even after a swift playoff exit, Arte was flying high. So high that he was getting too close to the sun. Angels fans awoke to the news that their beloved Anaheim Angels would be changing their name to the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim. To an outsider, this may not seem like a big deal. After all, Arte is a marketer, and the brand that is Los Angeles was too valuable and too close in proximity to not use. But to the longtime fans of Orange County who originally funded the entire cost of the stadium and then the renovations in the 90s, dropping the Anaheim from a prefix to an afterthought was a slap in the face. The city of Anaheim filed a lawsuit, arguing that the name change would cost the city millions of dollars in impressions every year. But it fell flat when Arte correctly pointed out that he adhered to the terms of the 1996 stadium lease by keeping Anaheim as a suffix. He was technically within his rights to do this, even if it would cost the city millions and piss off the team's most loyal supporters. But it grew the brand. This is the core tenet of Arte's regime. Moves are made to increase team value, revenues, and sales, not to satisfy the most loyal fans or to win the most games. His first array of free agent signings made the team better, particularly Vlad's contract. But more importantly, these players sold more jerseys and brought in more spectators. This is why so much money got burned. I'll run you through my methodology real quick. Stick with me here. I promise it'll make sense. Burned money represents how much a team overpaid a free agent. It's made up of 4 variables, the first being the cost of the contract. This is self-explanatory, and I got all the data from Cott's contracts on Baseball Prospectus. The second variable is how much F4 the player was worth over the course of the contract. Wins above replacement, or WAR, is a single number used to estimate how productive a player is versus the average replacement player, and the F signifies that it's from FanGraphs. The third variable is where things get a little tricky. Salaries have changed drastically in baseball over the last 2 decades, and I don't have a yearly figure for how valuable a win above replacement is on the free agent market, but I do have that figure for 2020, so I scaled down the value of a win based on the average salary during the first year of the contract. I call it the yearly multiplier. Multiplying the player's FR with the yearly multiplier translates the value into a dollar amount, and subtracting that from the cost of the contract determines if the team got a good or bad deal. We'll get to the last variable in a minute, but for now, let's use Vlad's contract as an example. He was paid $70 million and worth a bit over 20 FR. When we apply the 2004 yearly multiplier, we get a burned money value of about negative $24 million. This means that the Angels significantly underpaid Vlad for the production that they got. It's considered a really good contract looking back on it, so I think this ruling is fair. When we plug in the other big time contracts from the 2004 offseason, we get values of negative $26 million for Kelvin Escobar and $19 million for Bartolo Colon. Colon is the first instance of Arte's Angels burning money, which seems a bit rough considering he won a Cy Young in 2005, but that was really his one productive year with the team. I'm only counting up the bad money here. No forgiveness for signing good contracts. This is solely about money that should have been better spent. Let's see how the 2004 Angels offseason stacks up with the rest of the league. As we'll come to see, burning $20 million while spending about $140 million isn't bad at all. In fact, after Arte's first 3 off seasons, the Angels were in good shape. The only additional bad deals they gave out were 1-year contracts to Steve Finley and Jeff Weaver. But missing the playoffs in 2006 put pressure on Arte. He needed to make another big splash, and with Alfonso Soriano and Carlos Lee off the market, the Angels doled out a 5-year, $50 million contract. The recipient was paid to solidify their center field defense and be their new leadoff hitter. And one thing's for sure, Gary Matthews Jr. did lead off for the Angels in 2007, for 1 month. Here's a look at every Angels batting order from that season, and as you can see, Matthews is highlighted in red. By the end of the year, Matthews stops finding his name in the lineup on a daily basis, and the team accepts that they've made a terrible mistake. During his time in Anaheim, Matthews accumulated a negative half win above replacement. When we plug the contract into the equation, it tells us that the Angels burned more money than they even spent, which naturally is impossible. For this reason, any negative WAR values are set to 0. They also traded him in his last 2 contract years away to the Mets, paying all but $2 million of the remaining money. That there is our 4th variable. Money that other teams pay or that players opt out of doesn't count against the team that signed them. But regardless, the Angels burned $48 million on 1 contract, plus another $6.5 million for Shea Hillenbrand, who was also below replacement level with the club. Arte's Angels signed 8 guys to big-time contracts in their first 4 off seasons of ownership, and 3 of them were less productive than random minor leaguers. Luckily, the team's next big outfield addition was much closer to Vlad than he was to Matthews. Torrey Hunter was a big-time contributor on the 100-win 2008 team and the glue of the dynamic 2009 lineup. Hunter's deal kicked off a 4-year stretch where the Angels only burned about $15 million on 1 bad contract. Thanks a lot, Brian Fuentes. But what this chart doesn't tell you is that the Angels' payroll kept rising and money was still burning. The method I built is miles from perfect. Contract extensions and trades are, for the most part, not included in this data at all. As it turns out, it's really hard to track all the money in this game. In some cases, this flaw in my evaluation is unfair to the Angels, like with Mike Trout, who's been worth every penny of his first and second extensions thus far. But in other cases, this flaw saves the Angels from even more scrutiny. 2010 was the first first sub-500 season during Arte's tenure. The team scored about 200 less runs than they had the previous year. Eric Aybar slid into the leadoff spot while Alberto Callaspo played third base with Sean Figgins gone, and neither came close to replacing him. But they did have a young first baseman to anchor the lineup. Kendrys Morales, who finished 5th in MVP voting the previous year, hit his 11th home run of the year on May 29th. It just so happened to be a walk-off grand slam over the division rival Mariners. As he takes his trot, he passes his struggling former teammate Sean Figgins. The Mariners' new second baseman hasn't been the same hitter this year, and his defense at second base just isn't very good. The Angels dodged a huge bullet by letting him walk, which makes the error he committed on the previous play even more fitting. The club's biggest moment of the season up to this point doesn't happen without Sean Figgins, the Seattle Mariner. Maybe this funny little coincidence was the spark that the team needed to get out of its offensive rut.
Looks like
no.
This is injured at the bottom of that pile.
Unbelievable.
Fuck!
They're calling for the training staff right now.
He shattered his leg on a walk-off grand slam. He shattered his leg on a walk-off grand slam. The moment he landed wrong on the plate has ramifications that are still being felt by the Angels today, and it's really the moment where everything began spiraling out of control. First of all, he didn't only miss the rest of 2010, but also all of 2011 thanks to a botched surgery. This made the Angels all the more desperate for a bat entering 2011. Adrian Beltre was among the team's top free agent targets that offseason. He was coming off a fantastic prove-it deal with Boston, and the Angels wanted him to be the long-term Figgins replacement at third. With their top target Carl Crawford landing in Boston, Beltre became the Angels' main focus. Unfortunately, they lost out in the sweepstakes to their division rival Rangers, falling about $10 million short. For once, the Angels didn't overpay for their guy, and I can't really be too mad about that. But the Rangers deal happened to be one of the best signed during our window of data. In fact, it's second only to Max Scherzer's deal with DC. Missing out on a future Hall of Famer and new offensive and defensive anchor at third base stinks. But don't worry, Angels fans. As a consolation, your team made one of the worst trades I've ever seen. They moved Mike Napoli and Juan Rivera to the Blue Jays. In return, they actually agreed to pay Vernon Wells $87 million for 0.6 WAR. They committed more to Wells than the Rangers paid Beltre total, and it's not like Wells was a great player who just fell off once he got to Anaheim. 2010 was his first good season since he signed the extension with Toronto way back after 2006. He was 32 years old, and he was half a decade removed from being a Gold Glover in center field. Not to mention the contract was heavily backloaded. It just makes no sense that they didn't push harder to sign Beltre if they were willing to spend more money on the worst player. After just 2 seasons, Wells was shipped off to the Yankees, who somehow got bamboozled into paying $13 million of the remaining contract. Regardless, the Angels ended up burning nearly all of the $74 million they paid out to the veteran outfielder, and none of that is even visualized here. Oh yeah, I almost forgot one more thing. Guess where Mike Napoli played in 2011? And guess who their 2 best hitters were that year? Man, baseball's pretty funny, isn't it? The 2010 and 2011 Angels lacked an identity. Torrey Hunter, Jeff Mathis, and Jared Weaver were all great players, but the team lacked a superstar presence with Vlad gone. Tony Regions, the GM behind the Wells trade, resigned after the 2011 season. A second straight year missing the playoffs and the lowest attendance figures since Arte took over were too much for him to overcome. Arte was willing to spend, but he needed a GM who would do the job right. In steps Jerry Dipoto. Arte cited Dipoto's proficiency with baseball analytics as the driving force behind making him the new GM of the Angels. Listen, I can never know for sure whether or not Dipoto wanted to do what he did next, but what I do know is, analytically speaking, Dipoto would never make the next move. Not for 100 years. Yeah, this is the big one. The single most money burned on one contract in this era, and probably the most ever to this day. The Angels burned over $190 million on Albert, but Arte knew what he was doing here. Just a few days later, the Angels signed a $3 billion local TV deal with Fox Sports. The Anaheim Angels, with Mark Trumbo and Kendrys Morales playing first base, don't get $150 million per year. Morales being a question mark gave Arte the leeway to go through with the signing without it being so obvious. The second that TV deal was signed, it was over. Arte won. Every move and every decision he made up to this point was in pursuit of a deal like this. He renamed his team and gave it a shiny new paint job, but he didn't care how well the engine was running. But hey, even if giving Albert Pujols a 10-year contract in his 30s is ridiculous, and even if CJ Wilson only had 2 years under his belt as a starter, the Angels would surely be a better team than the previous year. Oh yeah, they also called up this center fielder in April who ended up being pretty good. They committed to going all in when they traded a group of prospects for Zach Greinke at the trade deadline, but a 3-week slump in August kept them just out of reach of the postseason. This was an 89-win team. They won more games in a tougher division than the AL champion Tigers did that year. Arte would probably point to this as justification for how he runs his team, but they were really only that good because Mike Trout single-handedly won them like 10 games. With the Rangers lineup becoming a Death Star and the A's getting good again, the smart baseball move entering 2012 would have probably been a rebuild. But Arte never rebuilds. That's not good for business. And with all that money invested in Albert, the Angels were forced into trying to contend. At the time, it was tough to claim that Arte never cared about winning, but the offseason before 2013 is all I need to point to prove how shallow his spending is. Greinke was a free agent after 2012, but the Angels weren't willing to match his market. He got 6 years and about $25 million per year from the real LA team, but this wasn't the Angels changing their ways, no. They instead put all of their eggs in a much more fragile basket. With Hunter's contract up, they needed a younger, bigger name to replace him. Josh Hamilton was nearing face of baseball territory in the early 2010s. His home run derby at Yankee Stadium was memorable, his MVP season was spectacular, he had the first 4-homer game in years, and he led the Texas Rangers to consecutive pennants. But beyond that, he was also the best feel-good story in sports at the time. The former first overall pick had such a bad drug problem that he barely played any baseball for 3 years before finally getting clean and breaking out on the national stage. So Arte gave him basically the same contract that he could have gotten Greinke with, but with 1 less year. But with 3 starting pitchers departing, the Angels needed to find replacements. The plan? Joseph Matthew Blanton. The 2013 Angels filled out the last dozen or so spots on the roster with cheap bargain bin options. J.B. Shuck was signed as a minor league free agent and played 129 games. Blanton and Jerome Williams combined to start 55 games. That's like a 30-year games given to 2 guys that no other team would touch. Regardless of the superstars, you can't have this much of a roster be mediocre if you're expecting to seriously contend. Adding 1 star in right field is mitigated by adding a replacement player in left. It was impossible to predict that Hamilton would regress as badly as he did, but that's the risk you take when you sign 1 guy to produce at the level of 2 players. It's all for jersey sales, it's all for marketing, not for the fans, not to compete, and certainly not to supplement homegrown talents like Mike Trout. If we look back at the burned money, we see that the Angels burned over $330 million in these 2 off seasons alone. All of that money spent for 78 wins, their lowest total since 2003. But hey, the Angels were now one of the top 10 most valuable MLB teams according to Forbes, and their attendance was over 3 million yet again. This year was a success for Arte Moreno. What a joke. The 2014 team is the one exception post-2009. Pujols stayed healthy, Ibar and Kendrick were great up the middle, and David Freese was their best third baseman since Figgins. Oh, and Trout also won his first MVP. The one guy who missed real time with injury was Hamilton, but his bat wasn't really missed in the lineup that actually had depth and health. The rotation behind Weaver and Wilson was filled out by young and talented arms. Garrett Richards, Matt Shoemaker, Hector Santiago, and Tyler Skaggs started 88 games, and they all performed. Richards was a serious Cy Young candidate by August and looked like the new ace of the team. Even though his season was cut short by a knee injury, the Angels rallied to a 17-3 stretch shortly after, outscoring their opponents by 73 runs in that span. The problem this year is that they peaked a little bit too early. As the top seed in the American League, they had home field advantage against the Royals, who just barely won their wildcard contest with Oakland. In their first chance in half a decade to make noise, with their best roster in years, the bats didn't make a sound. Trout, Pujols, and Kendrick did next to nothing, and the $125 million man didn't get on base once in the 3-game sweep. And it's only gone downhill ever since. Before the 2015 season, Hamilton notified the league that he relapsed on alcohol and cocaine. This wasn't his first relapse since he made it to the bigs, and he took full responsibility and got help when it happened. But the Angels were not apathetic in the slightest. Given what we know about Josh now, I have no sympathy for him as a person. He's done some truly despicable things. But just try to look past that for a second. The Angels didn't even pretend that they cared about the guy. Look at this quote from team president John Carpino. He wanted this guy suspended. That would have meant not paying his salary, and it's what they cared about more than the well-being of their player. Considering what happened to Tyler Skaggs just 4 years later, this team didn't have the moral high ground to take the just say no approach. I'm sure if Josh played up to his contract during his first 2 seasons, the team would have had a much different tone. But they wanted absolutely nothing to do with him and sent him back to Texas, eating almost all the money left on his contract. People wanted to see the rehabilitated superstar, not the mediocre druggie. This team operates like a cold machine with the sole purpose of growing in value. There is no Angels culture. The next and far more consequential act of the Angels' traveling circus of 2015 was their organizational power struggle. I still haven't mentioned the one man who had been with his team the entire time, even before Arte took over. Manager Mike Scioscia was the longest tenured in all of baseball and considered one of the best managers in the game. Dipoto ruffled his feathers when he fired his hitting coach a month into 2012, and the old school Scioscia never saw eye to eye with his analytically minded GM. Dipoto's main gripe was that Scioscia refused to deliver his scouting reports properly to the players. Their friction boiled over so badly in 2015 that Dipoto gave Moreno an ultimatum: either he's gone or I'm gone. And Arte was never going to fire his Hall of Fame manager. Dipoto probably would have done great things if he had any power to build the team his way in Anaheim, but if it wasn't Arte's allocation of funds, it was Scioscia's old school thinking. Now, Dipoto's Mariners are on the cusp of making their first playoff appearance in 2 decades, while the Angels look like they're years away. After Dipoto left, he admitted that signing Hamilton was Arte's decision, which confirms my previous suspicions about his lack of control. Most of the Angels front office was hired by Dipoto, so once he was out, all of the analytically competent staff in the organization were gone. At the end of the day, the 2015 team was solid, just missing out on a wildcard spot by 1 game, but the aftermath of the franchise shakeup sent the team into a tailspin. 2022 is the 7th consecutive sub-500 season for a team with Mike Trout and a top 10 payroll. The Yankees, the only other team who have burned more money, have not gone below 500 since 1992. Teams who spend at this volume are never supposed to be this bad, but the Angels managed to flirt with the basement year after year. The top 10 teams on this chart make up a distinct group of big spenders. 9 of these teams have won a pennant since 2004. But of course, this video is about the 10th team. Since Dipoto was fired, this team has been a complete and utter disaster. The Astros moving into the division certainly makes things harder, but it's become abundantly clear how there is zero plan. There's nothing besides selling tickets and jerseys, nothing besides sponsorships and advertisements. I don't need to tell you why it's a bad baseball move for a team barely fighting to stay above 500 to trade for Justin Upton, then extend him for 9 figures. Everyone in the world already knows how bad the Rendon contract is. Nothing has changed. There's zero investment in player development, awful drafting, and absolutely no depth to replace the injured players. And the only time the players on this team aren't injured is when the medical staff is feeding them oxy. Yeah, who would have thought? The high and mighty Angels who couldn't bear to put a druggie like Josh Hamilton in the outfield. That would have been a bad example for the kids. He should have just said no. Who would have thought that they're the ones with such a dangerous culture of painkiller abuse that led to the death of one of their brightest young players? And it all starts at the very top. The culture that Arte Moreno cultivated in his 20 years as the Angels owner will haunt Angels fans and Anaheim residents for decades to come. He takes no accountability for his shortcomings as an owner. There's a revolving door of front office personnel, managers, and players not named Trout. And that's before I even mention the political corruption. The city of Anaheim agreed to sell Angel Stadium to Arte for a suspiciously low price back in 2019. That prompted some poking and prodding from a little agency known as the FBI. What they uncovered regarding the mayor of Anaheim soliciting illegal donations from team officials eventually led to the mayor's resignation. Yes, Arte Moreno's business dealings surrounding the Angels were so shady that the entire government of Anaheim is being watched by the feds. Now, Arte is selling the team, probably because his city council was forced to block the sale that would have made him the king of Anaheim. Arte will bow out as one of the greatest villains of the sports world and maybe the biggest villain the city of Anaheim has ever known. And, as a consolation, he'll probably sell his Los Angeles Angels for a cool $3 billion. He made every wrong move, did everything the wrong way, the scummy, corporate, and despicable way, and he's probably gonna get an unthinkable 300% return on investment. The city of Anaheim lost. The Angels and their fans lost. Mike Trout and Shohei Ohtani lost. Baseball as a whole lost. But Arte won. And you should hate him even more for that.